Hello, my name is Todd Hutchison, and in this session I want to talk about leading people and managing performance for a business in the real estate industry. Real estate is all about a people business. It's all about building and sustaining relationships. That's why as a sales representative, it's often very hard to go into the business when you don't know anyone. In fact, when you start selling and you look at repeat business, people know you, they like you, they trust you, they even are aware of your profile out there and your brand, it means it's easier and easier to do business. That's why then moving from one area to a different area and having to start again can be difficult. Whilst you may be focused actually on the client, it's just as important to focus on your own team, because the team is an extension of you. That means your reputation and your success. So the more we can get a high-performing team, then the more successful we can be, and particularly if it's your real estate business you're wanting to build. There are 4 key elements to a great leader and worthwhile considering. Well, the first one is actually giving clarity. See, leaders that give clarity are who we're actually wanting. In fact, clarity is one of my favourite words. For example, as an employee, what's my title? What's my roles and responsibilities? What am I accountable for? How will you measure my performance? What's your expectations? What time do you want me to be at that house open? How long is it going to go for? What is the address? Who is the client? So you can see clarity is king. And if you want to get the most out of your staff, it's about giving them clarity. Of course, it's also being accountable yourself. People that walk their talk. So if you say to them you want them to do something, you should really be showing that you can do it yourself. You're setting the pathway for them to be guided by how you're performing yourself. And of course, it's far better off to be approachable. Approachable means that people will generally come to you more openly, more trustingly, more able to give those authentic conversations. And that means that we can identify some issues or concerns early before they become hugely large. And the last part of it is valuing others. See, when you feel valued, you actually step up. You actually want to do better for the business. And I remember having a staff member who'd been moved around all these different departments and came to my department. And the fact that I just sat down with them for my own sake, really, just to find out where they're going to fit, what they wanted to do, and how I was going to get the best out of them, unbeknown to me, that made them feel very valued. And when they feel valued, they actually stepped up. Because they weren't really happy to perform for the organisation. They're actually stepping up because I was nice to them. I made them feel valued. And again, when you feel valued, you actually increase your performance. So have a think about those 4 things, because we do have to focus on others that's in your team, because again, they're an extension of you. Well, the real estate industry is governed largely by state or territory legislation, such as in Western Australia, where we have the Real Estate and Business Agents Act 1978. And to comply with the obligations set out in the Real Estate and Business Agents and Sales Representatives Code of Conduct 2016. There's even an award which they refer to as the Modern Award for actually roles with minimum payments and understanding about salaries and wages, which is called the Real Estate Industry Award 2020. And that guides employment considerations. Now, the primary duties imposed on agents and sales representatives by the Code of Conduct are very similar in practice across the states and territories. But in Western Australia, these are to firstly act in good faith and exercise due skill, care and diligence. Also, to act in the best interests of their clients. To also be honest in their dealings with all persons involved in the transaction, and to act in accordance with the client's reasonable instructions. This is just good business practice. It's basically providing some trust, respect, and ability to actually engage with others and operate ethically. You may be thinking about the repercussions of any breach area. Well, you would need to check your own state or territory requirements, but in WA, there's a reprimand or a caution. You can get a fine for up to $10,000 for agents or $3,000 for sales representatives. And of course, you could receive a suspension or a cancellation of a license or registration. So the tools and guiding work, therefore, to make sure people are working within that framework is to recognise the golden rule, which we talk about, being process guides behaviour. So when you've got a process in place, you can actually guide behaviour. And that's effectively why that modern award, the Real Estate Industry Award 2020, sets out what's the minimum pay scales and what are the roles and what's the compensations that they should actually receive. In addition to that, you'll have your own governing policies in the organisation, and those governing policies are like little mini laws inside your organisation. In fact, the policies such as drugs and alcohol policy sets out what you can effectively take action against the employee for. Outside of those governing policies, you might have some guiding principles. Guiding principles are a bit like rules, but being guiding principles, it doesn't cover everything. It gives a square or a box around how to operate within. And then you'll have your workplace processes, which are procedures such as standard operating procedures or work instructions. And of course, always remember, your information management systems, your software and corporate applications also guide behaviour. So you can see all of these actually guide behaviour, and they also guide practices that will be good for the business. Now, when it comes to guiding an individual, there's a number of tools we can use. Firstly, the organisational chart. Now, the organisational chart sets out staff from the very top. Usually there's a board if it's a private company, and then you're going to have the chief executive officer or whatever we want to recall them, from a principal or any title you want to use. But then it goes down to each of the portfolios and where everyone sits. This means a person knows who they report to, but also who's any subordinates that report to them. Now, giving them a title is very important. Some people see titles are very important. Other people don't care so much for a title. But the way I look at titles, they should be at least being able to convey what they're doing, and to an outside person, get them to better understand what they are, such as the auctioneer. Then you have position descriptions. Position descriptions that are written really well usually have an overview that you can use in, say, a job advertisement, but it sets out the roles and responsibilities. But the best ones, often missed, also set out the authority, what they're allowed to do, what you're giving them authority to actually do, such as how much money they could spend if requiring to do so. In there, it will also set out the desired and the essential job requirements that's used when someone's applying for the job. And some position descriptions also detail things like whether you get a vehicle or a phone or other provisions such as leave loadings, etc. Then for every job, we should have some performance metrics. Performance metrics allows a person to know what they're actually aiming to. For example, how many houses to sell they're aiming every month, or how much income to generate through strata. This allows you to have something to talk about in what's known as a performance review process. Now, performance review process, typically an annual process where you sit down with the employee and you go through where their performance is at compared to what's expected of it. That's really a one-on-one where we get to speak about them and their role and their performance. And we give them guidance on what's working really well and some guidance on what could be improved. And we set out some plans, and sometimes it leads to discussions around some training they need or some other elements that are going to make them perform better in the job. Now, when it comes to probation periods, it's highly recommended that you actually provide that maximum 6-month probation. However, don't wait till the 6 months before you have a conversation. Actually, have a conversation halfway through on the 3-month mark, give them feedback, sit them down and set out the expectations. And if they're not aligned to where you're needing them to, make it very clear on what they have to do. Because just before that 6-month period, we've got to determine whether we're actually going to keep them or we're going to actually let them go. Now, these performance reviews can cover many different things, such as going through their roles and responsibilities and clarifying any new things they're doing or things that might have to be updated in their position descriptions, or equally, things that they're not actually doing. We want to go through their performance metrics. Sometimes we set the metrics for the next 12 months. But we're really looking at any knowledge gaps, skill gaps, and the opportunity to have an authentic conversation around the areas of improvement. Some genuine feedback that's going to help them perform and help them perform better for the business. This usually leads to some form of development plan that can cater for things like training they're expecting to have, on-job experience, and sets out a plan for when you go back the next year, you can actually compare their performance too. Now, whenever you bring in a new staff member, there is a need to induct them. Go through a formal induction that makes them aware of things like the policies, the layouts of the building, the principles of the business, and the way the business does things. That could include have some formal training, such as a qualification as required by certain roles, and some informal training, sometimes even on-the-job training. Now, training is available in many different ways here, from face-to-face training to online to what is known as blended. Now, blended means typically a balance between some form of online and some form of face-to-face or live online. The term informal training actually more refers to on-job training. Of course, you can have even some mentoring and coaching. And what is the difference? Well, a mentor typically is a person with a voice of authority, someone that's already had the experience, that's coming with a voice that's more about knowing the role. Just take sports, for example. You often find a coach was an ex-champion themselves. That makes them more of a mentor-based coach, whereas other coaches have never been a professional player. So coaching is more about the process, whereas a mentor doing some form of coaching is coming with a voice of authority. So that usually is someone that has done or is doing the job that you're aspiring or starting. Of course, we can learn other ways by having job sharing. So you may have two people working on the same job. And we often see that even in home opens when there's more than one sales representative at the home. Far better to manage and make sure the home's safe, you're getting to connect with everyone, and of course there's no things like theft happening. There's also a concept of job shadowing. As you can see, the motion of shadowing is when someone kind of knows someone else's job and can pick that up and may be the backup for that role in the absence of the person that's primarily doing it. And of course, getting things out of your head and on paper, procedures wins, because procedures make business systems, and business systems are often the key value to a business when you're going to sell it. Let's talk about unlawful or unfair dismissal. See, unfair dismissal, because it can happen, is governed by federal law, namely the Fair Work Act 2009 legislation. Firstly, policy sets out boundaries and an ability to take action on any breach. That's why having policies is very important, because if you are going to dismiss someone, it's far better off to have the power of the policy behind it. Some people have unfair dismissal because they don't actually have policies in place to show a breach, and therefore they may be entitled to get their job back or some compensation. And you know what? Sometimes the person just doesn't fit the role and they may need to leave. Now, people have actually asked me, how do you sleep at night when you have let someone go? Well, often I find that you've got to answer these questions. Did you provide them the clarity to the role? Did you provide them the right resources so they could do the role and be supported in the role? Did you provide the level of supervision or training? Did you set out the right metrics and manage your expectations? And did you provide them that ongoing mentorship and including some feedback, and ideally early feedback? And if you've done all these things and they're still not performing, sometimes they're in the wrong role, and sometimes in their attitude they may be in the wrong place at that point in time. But we've got to be careful here, because if you unfair dismiss them, you may actually have a claim on your doorstep. The Federal Fair Work Commission is Australia's national workplace relations tribunal. Employees have to be employed for at least 6 months before they can apply for unfair dismissal. Although working for a small business, they have to be employed for at least 12 months. Noting that a small business is defined as any business with fewer than 15 employees. That can include casuals, and you add them all up to what's called the full-time equivalent, or FTE. Actually, small businesses have different rules for dismissal, and that is covered by the Small Business Fair Dismissal Code that basically provides protection against unfair dismissal claims where an employer has actually followed the code. Once a person has been or believes to have been unfair dismissed, they first complete an unfair dismissal application with the Workplace Commission, and the Commission will send a copy of that application back to the employer as well. Then, the employer is required to respond within 7 days and can submit any jurisdictional objections that may have towards the claim. That means their justification that hopefully will deem it not to be an unfair dismissal. Now, the employer must send their response to both the employee and the Commission, and at that time, A commission conciliator will try to help the employer and the former employee to resolve the matter in a conciliation conference that is usually held by telephone. If the application can't be resolved through this process, it will go to a formal hearing or conference where the outcome will be decided by a member of the commission. Now, the key point to note is that the employee only has 21 days after dismissal to lodge a claim. And imagine that, you're actually working away, you've been dismissed, you might go into a stressed period of time, you might even be from overseas and go home and then come back and realise you've missed it because that 21 days is a deadlock. However, there are certain circumstances where it can be extended. And they have to be covered by national workplace relations systems for it to actually apply. And they also have to meet the eligibility criteria. And that means they're not getting too much pay, because generally that might indicate you do not meet the eligibility. And of course, they have to include the minimum employment period. Let's hope you don't need any advice on this one. So in summary, leadership is a learnt skill. Giving someone employment is one of the most impactful things you can do on their life. But remember though, to bring out their best, they need to enjoy the environment, and therefore they need to be empowered. Now, empowered doesn't mean to just let them go loose and be like a Lone Ranger. Empowerment means setting out the borders of which inside there they can actually go for gold. And therefore you're actually giving them some guidance, which is policies, procedures, and work expectations and things like performance metrics, so they can actually feel empowered, but within the borders of control. All the best with building your business.